Joining us now from London is Bilal Hafeez, Chief Executive of the Macro Hive. Good to have you with us, Bilal. So, the rest of the world was watching, once again, America's debt ceiling debate. Why does it matter so much to the rest of the world?
Well, I mean, the big reason is that the US is the largest economy in the world. And so what happens to the US affects the whole world. So if the US suffers a slowdown, a recession, a crisis of any kind, it will have a huge impact on the rest of the world, both economically and also through financial markets as well. Most markets in the world have a strong relationship with US markets.
And why is it such a contentious issue in the US? It's all about politics, isn't it?
Yes, it's all about politics, and it's an unusual situation that the US has where they agree budgets and spending and so on, but at the same time they have this debt ceiling issue, which essentially allows previously agreed budgets to be reneged on. So it's this uncomfortable duality that the US has, which sets itself up to always have these types of conflicts, especially when the US debt levels reach the threshold that's close to the debt ceiling.
The House Speaker said that this was a deal worthy of the American people. Was it?
Well, I think all sides of all political parties, all sides will claim victory with this agreement. In essence, both sides got something from the agreement. So overall, there's been an agreement of roughly $1.5 trillion of cuts have been agreed for the next 10 years. The Republicans wanted more. They wanted over $3 trillion. The Democrats wanted zero. So we landed somewhere halfway in between. So both sides can claim victory. There are some winners in this situation, and there are some losers. And so overall, it's a mixed bag.
This debt ceiling brinkmanship seems to happen with alarming regularity in the US. OK, we can breathe a sigh of relief, perhaps. Now, how long before it all happens again?
It's a great question, and it will happen again. The current agreement is that the debt ceiling, the next possibility of a debt ceiling conflict or debate will be 2 years away. So they have agreed to a 2-year extension of the debt ceiling. So this takes us to after the US election. So for 1 or 2 years, we can sigh a breath of relief, but it will come back, no doubt.
A deal usually calms the markets. What about future volatility, though, given that the Treasury is going to have to instantly replenish the cash that it's burnt through?
Yeah, so now we have the next phase of potential volatility, as you rightly point out. So the Treasury will have to build up its cash balances, the so-called TGA balances at the Fed, which will then mean that reserves held by banks at the Fed will have to be drawn down, which will be a drain on liquidity in the market. So a rapid increase in the Treasury's balances at the Fed will lead to a contraction of liquidity in the broader market, which could lead to more volatility. Now, the question is whether the Treasury and the Fed will rebuild the balances as rapidly as they have said they would, or will they slow it down to ensure that markets remain stable? And this is a big question mark for investors right now.
Denmark is the only the only country rather, which has a similar situation with the US, with these budget limits and deficit problems. Why do we never hear about problems with brinkmanship in Denmark? I mean, why does their situation never make the headlines that the US does?
Well, as usual, Denmark always is the perfect country on multiple different dimensions. But one key difference is that overall debt levels in Denmark are much, much lower than the US. The US debt levels, depending on how you calculate it, is between 80 to 90% of GDP. Denmark is closer to 30 to 40%. So it's considerably lower than the debt ceiling limit that they have in Denmark. Moreover, Denmark tends to run budget surpluses as well as deficits. US almost always runs deficits, so it's always running into fiscal problems, whereas Denmark tends to balance its books. And then the other thing, Denmark is much more of a friendly government and political system than the US. The US is highly polarized. In Denmark, both parties or the coalitions that run the country tend to agree jointly on the president or the leader of the country. And so it's much more of a collegiate type setup that you have in Denmark compared to the US.
80 to 90% of GDP. That sounds incredibly expensive. How does the US get away with that?
Well, that's the overall debt level as a share of GDP. And so that's the outstanding balance rather than the amount of interest that's used to service the deficit. So, in terms of the ongoing spending, around a third of government spending of the deficit is the interest rate expense. But the big reason why the US is able to do this and other countries can is essentially the government has the printing press. Ultimately, they're able to print money through the central bank, but also they have the ability and the monopoly on raising taxes. So because of those two, unique rights that the government has, they're able to run these much higher deficits and debt loads compared to a private household. So this is the advantage of having the right to print money and the right to tax.
Bilal, it's always great to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Great, my pleasure. Thank you.